The first sight of America came not through its cities or its soldiers, but through its children. When Japanese prisoners were transported inland from coastal docks to sprawling camps in the heartland, they expected to be hidden from the eyes of civilians. They thought they would vanish behind fences, unseen except by guards. Yet America was a nation that did not bother to hide its strength. As the trucks rolled through small towns, the prisoners sat stiffly, eyes averted, but curiosity betrayed them. Children lined the roads, boys and girls, waving flags, running barefoot alongside the convoys. The prisoners stared. These were not the fragile, starving children they had been told America produced. These were broad-shouldered, rosy-cheeked youngsters, some nearly as tall as the soldiers themselves. They laughed and shouted in English, their voices carrying with startling confidence. One prisoner later wrote, "I thought of my nephew in Tokyo, thin as a reed, coughing at night. These children, how could they belong to a land at war? They looked like giants." It was not only their size, though that was remarkable enough. It was their ease. They sprinted beside trucks carrying enemy soldiers without fear. Some even tossed apples or candy, daring to treat prisoners not as monsters but as curiosities. For men who had been taught that Americans were decadent and weak, the sight was devastating. Here was proof, living and laughing, that the enemy's soil had nourished children into strength that seemed almost unnatural. Inside the camps, the shock deepened. Farmers who employed POW labor often brought their children to the fields. The prisoners worked silently, backs bent, while American boys, broad-shouldered and sunburned, hauled sacks or pitched hay with ease. One prisoner muttered, "They are not children, they are young men." His companion whispered back, "And if they're child? Ren are so strong, what of their soldiers?" The diaries preserved from those months echo the same awe. A captured officer wrote, "We told ourselves that America was hollow, that it had no spirit. Yet I watched a boy no older than 12 lift a basket heavier than I could manage. He grinned as though it were nothing. In that moment, I knew the stories were lies." For the Japanese, who had seen their own homeland's youth worn thin by hunger, the comparison was unbearable. Children in Japan lined for rice, their bodies shrinking as the war dragged on. But in America, even in wartime, the young thrived. They were taller, stronger, healthier. The prisoners felt the truth in their bones. A nation whose children grew like this could not be broken easily. Some guards noticed the prisoners' stares. "Never seen kids before?" one asked with a smirk. The prisoners said nothing, but the shame was heavy. To admit the truth, that they were shaken to their core, was impossible. They returned to the barracks that night unsettled. The image of broad American children haunted them more than tanks or rifles ever could. The shock became sharper when local families approached the fences. Sometimes mothers brought their children to deliver small gifts, bread, fruit, knitted scarves. The guards allowed it on occasion, watching closely. The children pressed the offerings through the wire with fearless hands. The prisoners, hesitant, accepted them. What struck hardest was not the food itself, but the size of the hands offering it. Broad palms, sturdy fingers, nails clean and strong. A prisoner later wrote, "The boy's hand was like a man's. I thought, if the children are already men, then how many giants will this land send against us?" Evenings in the barracks buzzed with whispered comparisons. "Did you see them? They are taller than our officers. Their girls are strong too, walking with baskets heavier than ours." Some tried to dismiss it. "They are fed well only because they steal from others." But the truth was harder to silence. America's strength was not only in its weapons but in its children, living proof of abundance and vitality. One night, as guards patrolled outside, a prisoner spoke quietly into the dark. "We are finished. A nation with children like that will never lose." His words were met with silence, heavy and unanswerable. For the first time, the prisoners began to sense that defeat was not only military, it was generational. The future itself seemed to belong to the enemy. And that realization, born not from battles, but from the sight of tall, laughing American children, was more terrifying than any weapon they had faced on the battlefield. The shock of American children never left the Japanese prisoners. It followed them from the roadside parades into the farms where they worked, and from the farms back into the barracks at night. Day after day they saw boys and girls who carried themselves with the confidence of people who had never known hunger, never bent beneath. Each bombardment never trembled at air raid sirens. It unsettled them more than any guard's rifle. For the prisoners, the sight of such vitality gnawed like a worm inside the heart. The first true confrontation with this reality came during a farm detail in the Midwest. A group of prisoners was marched to a large wheat farm, their work to cut stalks under the watchful eye of guards. They expected hardship, perhaps cruelty. But what they found was humiliation of another kind. The farmers' sons, no older than 14 or 15, worked alongside their fathers, tossing bales of hay onto wagons with ease. Their muscles were rope-thick, their movements practiced and strong. One prisoner, already worn thin from years of military rationing, struggled with a bundle. A boy, his face still round with youth, stepped forward and hefted it as though it weighed nothing. The prisoner froze, his pride burning. That night he wrote in his diary, "I have carried rifles through jungles and hills. I fought men. Yet today I was shamed by a child. He is stronger than me. He is younger, and he is stronger." The camp whispers spread fast. The boys are giants. The girls, too. Some prisoners laughed bitterly, suggesting American food was pumped with unnatural strength. Others fell into silence, unable to reconcile what they saw with the propaganda they had been fed. They had been told America was decadent, its youth soft and spoiled. But these children worked the soil with arms hard as iron, with shoulders broader than Japanese men twice their age. Letters home, though censored, carried hints. A corporal scribbled, "The land here grows everything. Even the children are tall as trees. I fear for our homeland." The censors, perhaps not understanding the weight of such words, let them pass. Families in Japan, gaunt and weary, read them in disbelief. How could a nation at war still feed its children so well? How could its soil yield such strength while theirs yielded only scraps? It was not only the size of the children that stunned the prisoners, it was their confidence. American boys strode through fields with heads high, unafraid of the foreign men laboring beside them. Girls balanced baskets of apples or jars of milk, walking with steady grace. They laughed openly, their voices carrying over fences, their English sharp and lively. To the prisoners, used to a culture where children bowed their heads and deferred in silence, this boldness was disarming. One memory etched itself into many minds. A group of prisoners was repairing a barn wall under supervision when a farmer's daughter, perhaps 12 years old, skipped toward them carrying a basket of bread. She set it on a table and smiled before running off. Her hands were strong, her frame sturdy, her eyes fearless. A prisoner muttered, "Even their girls are warriors." Another replied, "They are not warriors. They are the proof of America's victory." The guards, too, noticed the way prisoners stared. One laughed and said, "What, never seen kids before?" But behind the joke was truth. These were not simply children. They were living symbols of a country untouched by war's famine. To see them was to see the future, and that future terrified the prisoners. Evenings in the barracks grew restless. The prisoners spoke of the children more than of battles lost or generals killed. They compared them to their own families back home. "My son is 13, one whispered. "He is thin, always sick. These boys here, they look like men of 20. Another sighed. "My daughter is weak. She has not had milk in years. These girls, they shine with health." Shame and despair grew heavier each night. And yet, beneath the shame, something else stirred. Admiration. Secretly, many of the prisoners respected what they saw. America's power was not only in tanks and planes, but in the simple abundance that gave strength to its youth. A lieutenant admitted quietly, "I used to think this land soft, but a country that can grow such children cannot be defeated. Even if we fought forever, they would send waves of soldiers grown from these fields." By summer, the prisoners began to anticipate the sight of children at the farms. They looked for them with a strange mix of dread and wonder. Some even learned the names of local boys whispered across fences by friendly farmers. A boy named Henry, tall and strong, carried water to the fields and laughed at the prisoners' broken English. Another, called Samuel, tossed apples over the wire, grinning when the prisoners scrambled to catch them. The prisoners wrote these names into their diaries, embarrassed but unable to stop. "Henry is taller than me, though only a boy," one wrote. "Samuel laughs like the world has never known war. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps this land does not know war as we do." The guards sometimes teased the children for their boldness, but never stopped them. Perhaps they knew the effect it had. For the prisoners, the sight of strong, fearless youth was as crushing as any weapon. It spoke of generations that would continue to rise, while their own homeland's children withered under hunger and bombs. One prisoner captured the feeling best in his hidden notes. "We thought America's strength was in machines. We were wrong. Its strength is in its children. They are the real army, growing even as we are broken. I fear them more than I fear their soldiers." The war outside the camps raged on, but inside the wire, the prisoners' greatest enemy became the evidence of American vitality. And every laugh of a child, every broad shoulder, every fearless smile reminded them of what they had lost, and what they could never hope to match. The surrender of Japan did not erase the memories carried inside the American camps. For the Japanese prisoners, the end of the war came with relief and despair in equal measure. They would live. They would go home. But home was a word sharpened by ruin, by firestorms and famine. Many wondered if their families had survived. Many feared they would return not to houses but to ashes. Yet alongside this dread there lived another image, one they could neither suppress nor explain. The towering figures of American children, laughing, running, carrying baskets, lifting hay bales as though they were born to strength. When the orders for repatriation came, the prisoners were marched once more through towns and villages. The trucks rattled along roads lined with civilians, and once again children appeared. They waved flags, shouted greetings, even threw candy. The prisoners, sitting stiff in the backs of trucks, stared at them as if staring at a vision. For months they had lived behind fences, seeing only glimpses of American youth. Now, as the convoys rolled toward the coast, the sight multiplied. Dozens, hundreds of children. The impression deepened. This was a land where even the youngest carried the confidence of giants. A diary entry from one prisoner described the scene. "We drove through a small town. Children stood in the streets. They were tall, broad, clean. Their laughter pierced me more deeply than any bullet. I thought of my own daughter, hungry, thin, coughing in the ruins of Tokyo. The difference was unbearable. I saw not just children, but the future itself, and it did not belong to us." On the docks, as the prisoners boarded the ships, families gathered to watch. Among them were children once again. Boys chased one another across the piers, their energy unbroken by rationing or fear. Girls clutched dolls or apples, waving as the vessels prepared to depart. The prisoners filed aboard in silence, but their eyes betrayed them. They could not look away. One soldier later confessed, "The ships that carried us home felt smaller than the children I saw that day. Their strength filled the horizon. I returned to Japan already defeated, not by weapons, but by those young faces." The voyage across the Pacific was long, the ocean restless. Nights on the deck, the men spoke in low voices, not of battles lost, but of what they had seen. "Did you see the boy with the shoulders like a man? Did you see the girl carrying 2 buckets at once?" They spoke as though remembering phantoms, images that had branded themselves onto their souls. Even those who refused to admit admiration could not deny the unease. When the ships reached Japan, the truth struck harder. The docks were crowded with families desperate to see their sons, but the children who greeted them were not like the ones they had left. They were small, gaunt, eyes sunken, bellies distended from hunger. They clung to mothers whose faces were lined with hardship. The returning prisoners stepped onto the soil of their homeland and felt pride collapse into sorrow. The contrast was merciless. One prisoner described the moment in a letter never sent. "I looked upon my own nephew, barely walking, ribs like bars across his chest. I remembered the boys in America, tall as men, running beside our trucks. The shame was unbearable. Our homeland is broken, and the proof is in the bodies of our children." For many, this was the true moment of defeat. Not surrender documents signed on battleships, not the lowering of flags, but the realization that the next generation, the lifeblood of a nation, was already lost. America's children had grown tall and strong in fields of abundance. Japan's had shrunk in the shadow of war. The memory haunted them for decades. Men who had seen death on battlefields admitted later that nothing unsettled them as much as those glimpses of American youth. They spoke of it in hushed tones, confessions made only in old age. "I saw their children," one veteran told his grandson. "That is when I knew the war was lost. Before I believed in our strength, but a nation with children like that, how could we ever win?" The women prisoners carried similar scars. They too remembered the girls who came to fences with gifts of fruit or scarves. They remembered broad-shouldered boys who lifted baskets heavier than grown men. They remembered the laughter that carried without fear, without shame. Returning to a homeland of silence and hunger, they never forgot the sound of those voices. Historians often overlook these memories. They write of generals, strategies, bombings. But in the quiet of homes, in whispered conversations, the truth endured. What broke the spirit of the prisoners was not only captivity, but comparison. In America, the future was tall, strong, fearless. In Japan, it was thin, trembling, gasping for breath. One diary summarized it in a single line. "America's power is not in its bombs, but in its children. They are the seeds of victory." As the years passed, some of these former prisoners built new lives. They worked the soil, repaired homes, raised families of their own. They loved their children fiercely, but always with the knowledge of what they had seen. When their sons grew to 12 or 13 and remained small, they remembered the American boys already towering at that age. When their daughters struggled with hunger, they recalled American girls with strong arms and fearless eyes. It was a wound that never fully healed. And yet, in some strange way, it also became a lesson. Some dedicated their lives to ensuring that Japan's children would never again be left so weak. They worked to rebuild schools, to secure food, to fight for a future where strength and health would not belong only to others. Quietly, without speeches, they built a promise to themselves. Never again would they allow their children to be so diminished. But still, at night, when old men closed their eyes, the memory returned. The trucks rolling through towns, the flags waving, the laughter of boys running alongside, broad-shouldered and confident, their voices ringing like bells of victory. It was a sound louder than gunfire, a sight sharper than steel. It was the moment they knew, deep in their bones, that their war had already been lost,